I'm reading from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 659. The fact of God's unconsciousness throws a peculiar light on the doctrine of salvation. Man is not so much delivered from his sins, even if he is baptized in the prescribed manner and thus washed clean, as delivered from fear of the consequences of sin, that is, from the wrath of God. Consequently, the work of salvation is intended to save man from the fear of God. This is certainly possible where the belief in a loving Father who has sent his only begotten Son to rescue the human race has repressed the persistent traces of the old Yahweh and his dangerous effects. Such a belief, however, presupposes a lack of reflection, or a sacrificium intellectus. That would be a sacrifice of the intelligence, and it appears questionable whether either of them can be morally justified. We should never forget that it was Christ himself who taught us to make usurious use of the talents entrusted to us, and not hide them in the ground. One ought not to make oneself out to be more stupid and more unconscious than one really is, for in all other aspects we are called upon to be alert, critical, and self-aware, so as not to fall into temptation, and to examine the spirits who want to gain influence over us and see whether they are of God. 1 John 4:1. So that we may recognize the mistakes we make. It even needs superhuman intelligence to avoid the cunning snares of Satan. These obligations inevitably sharpen our understanding, our love of truth, and the urge to know, which, as well as being genuine human virtues, are quite possibly effects of that spirit which searches everything, even the depths of God. 1 Corinthians 2:10. These intellectual and moral capacities are themselves of a divine nature, and therefore cannot and must not be cut off. It is just by following Christian morality that one gets into the worst collisions of duty. Only those who habitually make 5 an even number can escape them. The fact that Christian ethics leads to collisions of duty speaks in its favor. By engendering insoluble conflicts and consequently an afflictio animi, it brings man nearer to a knowledge of God. All opposites are of God. Therefore man must bend to this burden. And in so doing, he finds that God in his oppositeness has taken possession of him, incarnated himself in him. He becomes a vessel with divine conflict. We rightly associate the idea of suffering with a state in which the opposites violently collide with one another, and we hesitate to describe such a painful experience as being redeemed. Yet it cannot be denied that the great symbol of the Christian faith, the cross, upon which hangs the suffering figure of the Redeemer, has been emphatically held up before the eyes of Christians for nearly 2,000 years. This picture is completed by the 2 thieves, one of whom goes down to hell, the other into paradise. One could hardly imagine a better representation of the oppositeness of the central Christian symbol. Why this inevitable product of Christian psychology should signify redemption is difficult to see, except that the conscious recognition of the opposites, painful though it may be at the moment, does bring with it a definite feeling of deliverance. It is on the one hand a deliverance from the distressing state of dull and helpless unconsciousness, and on the other hand, a growing awareness of God's oppositeness, in which man can participate if he does not shrink from being wounded by the dividing sword, which is Christ. Only through the most extreme and most menacing conflict does the Christian experience deliverance into divinity, always provided that he does not break, but accepts the burden of being marked out by God. In this way alone can the Imago Dei realize itself in him and God become man. The seventh petition in the Lord's Prayer, "But deliver us from evil," is to be understood in the same sense as Christ's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Quote, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Unquote. Matthew 26:39. In principle, it does not seem to fit God's purpose to exempt a man from conflict and hence from evil. It is altogether human to express such a desire, but it must not be made into a principle, because it is directed against God's will and rests only on human weakness and fear. Fear is certainly justified up to a point, for to make the conflict complete, there must be doubt and uncertainty as to whether man's strength is not being overtaxed. Paragraph 660. Because the Imago Dei pervades the whole human sphere and makes mankind its involuntary exponent, it is just possible that the 400-year-old schism in the Church and the present division of the political world into two hostile camps are both expressions of the unrecognized polarity of the dominant archetype. Paragraph 661. The traditional view of Christ's work of redemption reflects a one-sided way of thinking, no matter whether we regard that one-sidedness as purely human or as willed by God. The other view, which regards the atonement not as the payment of a human debt to God, but as reparations for a wrong done by God to man, has been briefly outlined above. This view seems to me to be better suited to the power situation as it actually exists. The sheep can stir up the mud in the wolf's drinking water, but can do him no other harm. So also the creature can disappoint the Creator, but it is scarcely credible that he can do him a painful wrong. This lies only in the power of the Creator with respect to the powerless creature. On this view, a wrong is imputed to God, but it is certainly no worse than what has already been imputed to him if one assumes that it was necessary to torture the Son to death on the cross merely in order to appease the Father's wrath. What kind of father is it who would rather his son were slaughtered than forgive his ill-advised creatures who have been corrupted by his precious Satan? What is supposed to be demonstrated by this gruesome and archaic sacrifice of the Son? God's love, perhaps? Or his implacability? We know from chapter 22 of Genesis, Abraham and Isaac, and from Exodus 22:29, that Yahweh has a tendency to employ such means as the killing of the son and the firstborn in order to test his people's faith or to assert his will. Despite the fact that his omniscience and omnipotence have no need whatever of such savage procedures, which moreover set a bad example to the mighty ones of the earth. It is very understandable, therefore, that a naive mind is apt to run away from such questions and excuse this maneuver as a beautiful sacrifice of intelligence. If one prefers not to read the 89th Psalm, the matter will not end there. He who cheats once will cheat again, particularly when it comes to self-knowledge. But self-knowledge, in the form of an examination of conscience, is demanded by Christian ethics. They were very pious people who maintained that self-knowledge paves the way to knowledge of God. They were very pious people who maintained that self-knowledge paves the way to knowledge of God.